Phillipa, congratulations on the film.
Thank you.
It was great to walk in Middle-earth again. When we all heard the news that it was going to be 3 films instead of 2, what was your argument sort of for and against it?
It was really about the stuff we were going to have to not tell. Right. The bits of the story that we knew would just basically never be told as a piece of film, because The Hobbit is really the place where you need to tell it. One of the main things, of course, is in the book, which is a children's story, and is only about 300 pages long. Gandalf the Grey disappears on a couple of occasions. Because of The Lord of the Rings, we actually know where he went and what he was doing. And that, in and of itself, that particular piece of storytelling is extraordinary, and it's actually quite exciting. And it has huge repercussions, of course, for what followed after. So it was a pretty easy decision to begin with to say, okay, we want to tell that part of the tale. And as soon as you begin to tell that part of the tale, there's also other parts of this tale. Because the truth is, Professor Tolkien didn't stop writing The Hobbit after he finished writing The Hobbit. He kept writing it. He actually went back and rewrote the very famous scene between Gollum and Bilbo. And then he actually managed to explain it, this revision, as in story terms, as being part of the influence of the ring on Bilbo, in that he couldn't actually quite... He must have carried a little bit of guilt about how he actually managed to secure the ring off Gollum, and whether the actual riddle, the last question, was fair or not, which I think is a brilliant piece of storytelling in and of itself.
And it shows a lot, because it's like the moral duplicity doesn't exist in Bilbo. He's a very simple character at the start, and yet we know him at the end, don't we?
Yes, we do.
In Lord of the Rings. So that's quite exciting. And I did wonder, adapting a prequel and mining the rich mythology that was there, how conscious were you that you had these 3 films that had come before that you had to tie things up with?
I think it was interesting. There was a... If we had made The Hobbit first, as opposed to having made The Lord of the Rings, I think this film of The Hobbit would have been very different. But the truth is, we did make The Lord of the Rings first. These films were always going to be set against the backdrop of a Middle-earth that we'd already explored, characters who'd already been brought to life, most notably, of course, Gandalf the Grey, as portrayed by Sir Ian McKellen. You could never step away or make a character that was going to be lesser than the character that you'd already met and knew, and in many cases, for a lot of filmgoers, fallen in love with. Someone like Andy Serkis had already found the duality of that character, the Smeagol and Gollum, and the way they exist together. That's not actually there in The Hobbit. But it was pretty much a no-brainer for us that, of course, they were both gonna be there in this scene, and they both are, in spades.
In terms of the tone of the film, you said it was, you described it as a children's book, and I think this is a lot of people's introduction into fantasy. It is lighter in tone, but the overall threat is still there. Can you talk a little bit about putting characters back on screen who we know, but at a very different time in their lives and with a very different backdrop? There seems to be a much lighter feel to Gandalf, to Elrond. Can you talk about how you've written these characters so well in 10 years ago, having to go back to them and as a screenwriter sort of adapt them, into the characters in this new setup?
I know Ian loves Gandalf the Grey. He has an appreciation for Gandalf the White, but I think in his heart he loves Gandalf the Grey, and I think I understand why, because he's much more of this earth. He's much closer to this earth. He's the Gandalf who loves a good drink and glass of wine, and it can sleep out rough under the stars. Doesn't necessarily have the ticking clock that exists in The Lord of the Rings, the weight of the world on his shoulders. as yet. In fact, to me, Gandalf the Grey in The Hobbit is a little bit more of a detective, because both he and Galadriel are beginning to understand that something is moving in the shadows, as they say. And what ensues is almost like a detective story to understand what this entity is, what this force is, and who this necromancer is, which I loved, going into that piece of storytelling. I think it's great. And of course, with Ian McKellen playing Gandalf, it's not a bad thing either.
In terms of the cast, you have to find voices for each of these many dwarves, and it's not as varied as the Fellowship. So a couple of questions. First of all is how do you find the character moments for each of the characters to make sure that their character is built up enough, and also that propels the narrative? And also looking forward, how are we expecting to see that dynamic change in the next two films?
I think one thing we learned making The Lord of the Rings is that you have to let the audience come to the characters quite naturally. That if you create scenes just in order to introduce a character or a character trait, it's going to hit the cutting room floor, basically. You have to allow great actors to just be that character and understand that the audience are going to be drawn to them quite naturally, I think. And also the fact that, we've now got a trilogy makes it easier for you to do that, to spend time with each of the characters. But what we did understand with the dwarves is, as much as they are, Professor Tolkien describes them as a secretive race. They keep very much to themselves. They're slightly suspicious of others and outsiders. Once you get to know them, as Bilbo does, they're all very individual and different. And what you do have within this, the company of Thorin Oakenshield, are family groupings, which make it slightly easier to get to know them, I think. And so we have our Northern Irish dwarves, led by Jimmy Nisbet, brilliantly playing Bofa, who are much more like the miners. They are actually those three, Bomber, Bofa and Biffa, are the three that aren't related to Thorin Oakenshield. So we thought that was an interesting. That's one of the reasons why they have the Northern Irish accent. And
going forward, are we going to find that as the decisions become more grave, that we see the dynamics change?
The story gets darker as it moves along. As much as it is a beautiful, wonderful, rollicking, funny children's story in the beginning, it does grow quite dark, and people tend to forget how tragic the end actually is. So we are working towards earning that. But, along the way we get to meet things like a man who changes into a giant bear and a fire-breathing dragon that can speak. So it's not a bad day.
Exciting stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.